There is a stretch of coastline right now, today, where the ground you could have stood on 20 years ago simply does not exist anymore. Not damaged, not changed, gone, swallowed. And the strange part isn't that it happened. The strange part is that nobody can agree on why. Some scientists will tell you this is just nature doing what nature has always done. We've got maybe 40-50 years before entire regions vanish off the map. Other scientists, working with the exact same data, will tell you nature has almost nothing to do with it. That human hands built this disaster brick by brick, dam by dam, decade by decade. And a third group, often ignored, often shouted down in conferences, will tell you both sides are exaggerating, that the numbers being thrown around are built on shaky measurements and worse assumptions. Three groups of serious, credentialed scientists, same coastline, same satellite images. In many cases, the same raw data, and three wildly different conclusions about how much time we actually have left. This isn't a story about a cursed triangle or a monster in a lake. It's something stranger. The threat here is completely real, fully documented, happening in broad daylight. And the experts studying it cannot agree on the most basic question. How fast is this actually happening, and who's really responsible? By the end of this video, you'll have heard all three sides. The catastrophists, the blame humanity camp, and the skeptics who think the whole panic is overblown. I'm not going to tell you who's right. I'm going to lay out what each side uses as proof and let you decide which argument actually holds up. If that sounds like your kind of investigation, hit subscribe now, because we're about to walk straight into one of the messiest scientific disputes happening on the planet right now. The place at the center of all this is the Caspian Sea, technically the largest enclosed body of water on Earth, bordered by 5 countries. And right now, losing water fast enough to trigger a genuine unresolved fight inside the scientific community. Here's the basic shape of the problem before we get into who's arguing what. The Caspian has no connection to any ocean. It's fed by rivers, mainly the Volga, and it loses water only through evaporation. One way in, one way out. No outlet to a larger sea, no flushing system. That single detail is exactly why this argument got so ugly. In a closed system like this, every drop matters. And figuring out where the drops are actually going has turned into a full-blown forensic investigation, with 3 teams of experts pointing fingers in 3 different directions. Satellite measurements going back to the 1990s show the water level dropping steadily, with periods of sharp acceleration that genuinely alarmed researchers across the region. Current estimates put the total drop at more than a meter over the last 3 decades, with the pace picking up noticeably since the mid-2000s. A meter doesn't sound like much until you understand the geography. The Caspian is shallow across enormous stretches, especially in its northern basin. So a drop like that doesn't just nibble at the edges. It can expose tens of thousands of square kilometers of seabed that used to be underwater. We're talking about an area larger than some entire countries, just gone from beneath the surface. Fishing ports that operated for generations now sit kilometers from the actual waterline. Boats that used to dock right at the harbor are now stranded next to dry, cracked mud. That was seafloor within living memory. Old men in these towns can point to a spot in the distance and tell you, that's where I used to fish as a boy. Now it's desert. This isn't a hypothetical future. This is photographed, documented, happening along real coastlines right now, while 3 groups of scientists argue about what to call it. So here's the question everyone in this fight is trying to answer. Why is this happening? How fast will it continue? And is there anything that can actually be done about it? And that's exactly where the agreement falls apart completely. The first group we'll meet looks at temperature records, evaporation rates, and long climate cycles. and concludes this is primarily a natural disaster that human activity is only mildly speeding up. Their strongest card is that the Caspian has shrunk dramatically before, long before a single dam or factory existed anywhere near it. The second group looks at that same coastline and sees something completely different. They point straight at the Volga River, which supplies somewhere around 80% of all the water flowing into the Caspian. And they note that the Volga has been dammed, diverted, and drained for irrigation and hydroelectric power for almost a century now. To this camp, blaming climate change first is almost a convenient distraction from a very specific case of upstream water theft. And the third group, smaller but getting louder every year, argues that the other two are arguing over a fire that might be partly smoke. They claim the satellite and ground measurements driving this entire panic have serious calibration problems. 3 explanations. 3 different versions of how much time is actually left. And every single one of them claims to be the rigorous one. Next, we're going inside the strongest argument from the camp that believes the clock is running out faster than anyone in power wants to admit. Let's start with the Catastrophists, because they have the scariest numbers. To be fair to them, those numbers come from real, peer-reviewed research, not internet panic. Their core argument goes like this. Yes, the Caspian has shrunk before. Geological records show regression and expansion cycles going back thousands of years, tied to ice ages, shifting monsoon patterns, and long-term climate swings. Nobody on any side denies this history. But the Catastrophists say something fundamentally different is happening right now, and it comes down to one word: speed. Previous natural shrinking events unfolded over centuries, slow enough for ancient settlements to simply relocate a few kilometers inland over a generation or two. What's happening now is compressed into decades, not centuries. One widely cited study projected the Caspian could drop by an additional 9 to 18 meters by the end of this century. Let that number sit for a second. 18 meters isn't an eroding coastline. That's an entirely different sea. Entire port cities like Atirau and Aktau could end up dozens of kilometers from open water, within the lifetime of people alive right now. The mechanism they point to is brutally simple: heat. As regional temperatures climb, evaporation off the surface of the Caspian increases, while snowpack and rainfall patterns feeding the Volga River shift in ways that don't reliably replace what's being lost. Less water coming in, more water leaving through evaporation. In a closed basin with no outlet, that math only goes one direction. They point to the Aral Sea, a few hundred kilometers away, as a preview of what unmanaged decline looks like. The Aral was once the 4th largest lake on the planet. Within about 50 years, it lost more than 90% of its volume. Fishing fleets that once worked open water are now rusting in literal desert, kilometers from any visible water, with abandoned ships sitting on sand, like some kind of post-apocalyptic monument. The Catastrophist camp's argument is essentially, we've already watched this exact movie play out next door. We know how it ends if nothing changes. And the Caspian is already showing the same early warning signs. Declining inflow, rising regional temperatures, accelerating water loss in the shallow northern sections first, exactly where the Aral started collapsing too. If they're right, coastal communities across Kazakhstan, Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran, and Turkmenistan aren't looking at a slow inconvenience. They're looking at the early chapters of the Aral Sea story, just happening to a sea more than 10 times its size. But before you accept that conclusion completely, you need to hear what the second camp says about who's actually responsible. The second camp starts with a question that sounds almost too simple. If the Volga supplies the overwhelming majority of the Caspian's incoming water, why are we talking about temperature before we talk about the river itself? The Volga is one of the most heavily engineered rivers on Earth. Since the Soviet era, it's been dammed at multiple points to generate hydroelectric power and to supply water for massive irrigation projects across southern Russia. There are reservoirs along its length so large they're sometimes mistaken for natural lakes on a map. Each one of those dams interrupts natural flow, holds back water for power generation and farming, and changes exactly how much eventually reaches the Caspian and when. This camp's argument is straightforward. Humans built a tap, and for 100 years we've been deciding how far to turn it. Blaming a vague, distant force like climate change lets everyone involved in that century of decisions completely off the hook. During large-scale cotton and grain irrigation projects in the 1960s and 70s, water diversion from rivers spiked dramatically. And not coincidentally, this is roughly when the Aral Sea's collapse began accelerating violently. To this camp, the Aral isn't a preview of climate change. It's a direct, documented case study of what happens when river water gets diverted at industrial scale. Applied to the Caspian, their argument is that current Volga flow is still meaningfully reduced compared to its natural state. Every cubic meter held back upstream for a hydroelectric plant or a wheat field never gets the chance to offset evaporation downstream. This camp argues that focusing primarily on temperature creates a convenient narrative where nobody bears direct responsibility. It becomes everyone's fault and therefore nobody's fault. Meanwhile, the actual decisions made by specific governments get treated almost as background noise. If the core problem is mismanaged river flow rather than runaway climate change, the decline could be slowed through different water policy. That's closer to, we have a policy problem we're choosing not to fix. Both of these camps agree on one thing: the water is genuinely disappearing and the consequences are real. The third camp doesn't accept even that much, and their argument is, frankly, the most uncomfortable one to sit with. This camp is smaller, and they tend to get talked over at conferences. Partly because their argument sounds, on the surface, like climate denial. It isn't. Most of these researchers fully accept that the Caspian is losing water and that human activity plays some role. What they're challenging is the measurement methodology itself. Measuring the water level of something as enormous and remote as the Caspian Sea isn't as simple as reading a ruler off a dock. Modern measurements rely heavily on satellite altimetry, bouncing radar signals off the water's surface from orbit. It's an extraordinary technology, genuinely revolutionary for tracking global sea levels. But it comes with margins of error and calibration drift over time, with known complications when dealing with inland seas that have different salinity and wave patterns. Several of the most widely cited dramatic decline figures come from stitching together data from multiple different satellite missions, each with slightly different instruments, calibration standards, and blind spots. When you combine all of that into one smooth-looking graph showing a clean, alarming downward slope, you're potentially papering over a lot of underlying uncertainty. Some Soviet-era measurements from the mid-20th century were taken using methods that don't translate cleanly into modern satellite standards. If your starting point is shakier than advertised, every comparison built on top of it inherits that same shakiness. Their conclusion isn't nothing is happening. It's something closer to we genuinely don't know if it's happening at the rate everyone keeps quoting in headlines. Treating a contested number as settled fact does real damage to public trust in science. It's a less satisfying answer than either of the first two camps. There's no clean villain, no clean countdown clock, no clean solution to point at. Just a request for more rigorous measurement before anyone commits to apocalyptic timelines. So where does that actually leave us? 3 groups of credentialed experts, 3 different explanations, 3 different timelines, ranging from "we have decades and it's accelerating" to "we have a fixable river management problem" to "slow down, the numbers might not even be solid." What nobody disputes across all 3 camps is that fishing communities that have existed for generations are already watching the water retreat from their doorsteps. Whether you call that climate change, river mismanagement, or a measurement story still being sorted out, the towns losing their coastline don't get to wait for the scientific community to reach consensus. If you found this kind of genuine, unresolved scientific argument more interesting than another tidy mystery with a neat bow on top, that's exactly the kind of story this channel digs into. Subscribe if you want more of these deep, honest investigations where the experts themselves don't even agree. And drop a comment telling me which of the 3 camps you found most convincing. I'm genuinely curious whether most people land on the climate explanation, the river explanation, or the skeptics calling everyone's bluff. Because somewhere along that Caspian coastline right now, while we've been talking, the water has receded just a little bit more. And in 50 years, somebody is going to look back and know definitively which one of these 3 camps was right. We just don't get that luxury yet.